Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you hear me, if you can't hear me in the back, I was going to say if you can't hear me in the back, wait, but then you wouldn't hear the suggestion. Can you all hear? Yes, thank you. Well, welcome, and we're grateful to Temple Brit Kodesh for allowing us to use the facility. Typically, RTA seminars are dinner seminars, and they're held in the large hall behind us. For this date, there are other functions already there. And so we were able to secure only the sanctuary where we are now. And in the sanctuary, no food or drink is allowed. So I apologize, and I invite you to join us at future dinner seminars. You would be our guest. I also am obligated to indicate to you that this session may be taped and definitely is being live streamed on the website of the Rochester Coalition for Public Education. Just so you know. I won't say much about this topic because I'm as anxious as you are to hear our distinguished keynote. But as president of the Rochester Teachers Union, I thought I would give you a very brief summary of what we glean to be the collective wisdom of teachers on this topic. And that's particularly in two categories when it comes to tests. The first is about quality of tests, and the other is about uses of tests. Teachers are not opposed to assessments. They do it all the time. They know they need assessments. And the most common form of assessment is not even the one that is formally recognized, and that is teacher observation. Teachers trust that, students trust that, parents trust that. Bureaucrats, not so much. Teachers believe that you have quality testing when they are developmentally appropriate, when they come from multiple sources and take multiple forms, when they are real to life, when they are culturally relevant and responsive, when they measure what actually was supposed to be taught, when they are performance-based, meaning that we do not trust so much tests that require memorization or repeating what you've memorized, but rather, and don't even ask, what do you know? They ask, what are you able to do with what you know? That they are good quality, they're credible to the test taker, no less than to the test maker. That these tests are credible when they are the continuation and the application of knowledge, and when they are not a one-shot deal, but rather a system of assessment. When it comes to the uses or misuses of tests, teachers believe what Linda Darling-Hammond has been saying for decades, that tests and assessments should be information and not verdicts on students, teachers, schools, or district. That the use of tests is best when it's timely feedback to the teachers and to the students, when it's as free as it could be from stress, when it robs students as little as possible of learning time, and when it is not used primarily for labeling and punishing students, teachers, or schools. So because this is such an important topic, there will be, indeed, a follow-up. This is not a one-shot deal. And in the handouts that you had available, or you may pick up, here are some of the already confirmed opportunities to join a discussion group that will do more than just discuss. They will actually come up with better ideas on how to improve the situation and how to put it into action. This is why Dr. Koretz being here is so important to this community, and we are grateful that we have such a distinguished keynoter. And to introduce him, I would like to invite our local distinguished educator from the University of Rochester Graduate School of Education, Warner School, Dr. David Hirsch.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We are thrilled to see so many people interested in the topic of assessment in schools. Before introducing today's speaker, I need to acknowledge support from our co-sponsors, which include the Rochester Teachers Association, Writers and Books, which has books on for sale outside at the front door, Citizen Action, and the Warner Graduate School of Education at the U of R. In addition, Writers and Books, the Warner School, Nazareth College, St. John Fisher College, and Barnes & Noble are leading discussions to follow up on this conversation at venues on their campuses. What we encourage you to do is go to the Rochester Coalition website and check out which sessions you'd like to go to, when and where they are, and to sign up ahead of time. The Rochester Coalition for Public Education began 30 years ago as the Coalition for Common Sense in Education. Over the past 30 years, over the past 3 decades, we have brought to Rochester many speakers, too many to name. Jonathan Kozel, Debbie Meyer, and last year, the current Chancellor of Education, Betty Roser. We have also lobbied policymakers both locally and in Albany. During the past year, we have set up a website. The address is on the flyer, which are again available as you come into the front door. And we've also set up a Facebook page. Sarah and Andrew McGinnis are recording tonight's event, which will be available to you on YouTube in a few days. Please check the website for updated information. Sarah is also managing our new Facebook page. Ayanna Smith has set up and is managing our new website. Both Sarah and Ayanna are current or former students in the Warner School's master's program. A reminder that our hope is that tonight's event is the impetus for community conversation about how we need to rethink assessment in schools and create new methods. Please think about participating in a follow-up conversation and go to our website to register. So let me introduce our speaker. I became aware of Professor Koretz's research through his 2008 book, Measuring Up, What Educational Testing Really Tells Us, and realized that he was someone who was both theoretically, political, and practical understanding of how schools work. Therefore, when earlier this year I saw an ad for his new book, The Testing Charade, I immediately ordered it, read it, and recommended it to my colleagues with the Rochester Coalition for Public Education, who agreed that we needed to bring him to Rochester, which is why he is here today. Daniel Koretz is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at Harvard University. He is an expert on educational assessment and testing policy. A primary focus of his work has been the impact of high-stakes testing on all aspects of education, including the effects of testing programs on educational practice, the assessment of students with disabilities, international differences in the variability of student achievement, and the application of value-added models to educational achievement. His current work focuses on the equity implications of high-stakes testing, which, given the significant economic and racial inequality in Rochester, should be of special interest to us. Koretz is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow at the American Education Research Association. His doctorate is in developmental psychology from Cornell University. Before obtaining his doctoral degree, Koretz taught emotionally disturbed students in public, elementary, and junior high schools. So with that, please welcome Daniel Koretz.
Is this okay in the back? No. How about that? Is that better? Okay. There's a real echo here, so it's hard to know. As I was listening to Adam, I thought maybe we could just treat this, since we can't eat, as a short fast to protest inappropriate testing. We'll make it not too long a fast. First, I want to thank David and Adam, Dan Dumasich, and other folks who organized this for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be with you today. I want to do several things before we start open discussion. First, I want to tell you a little bit about this book, why I wrote it. Second, I want to summarize some of the good and bad news that's in the book. It's mostly bad, about the effects of high-stakes testing. But what I really want to focus on is what's in the end of the book, which is some suggestions about things we might do differently. I don't think really there's that much to argue about in the first part of the book. I think the evidence is reasonably clear, but there's a lot to argue about in designing alternatives, and your input to that debate as teachers is going to be a very important part of it. So why did I write the book? Quite a long time ago, it's probably now 6 years ago, I got an email from an editor at the University of Chicago Press whom I'd never heard of, who wrote me to say that she was going to be in Cambridge and asked if she could come visit. I said, sure. So she came to visit, and she started off the meeting by saying that she'd read my first book, the one that David mentioned, which is really just a layperson's guide to testing. And I said, well, what did you think? She said, well, it's a good book, but you were pulling your punches. And I thought, well, yes. I mean, that's what academics do. You use modest, moderate adjectives, and you try to be even-handed. And she said, we want to sign you for a book in which you don't pull your punches. And I was just taken aback. I said, well, just go to Barnes & Noble. You can buy polemical books about testing. You don't need to publish one. And she said, a lot of them are written by people who don't know anything about testing. We want to sign you to write a book in which you don't pull your punches. So I spent 4 years dithering about this because it's just not the kind of thing people do in academia. And finally I decided to do it. And the reason is the subtitle of the book. I got tired of the pretense. We have evidence that's been accumulating now for about 30 years, just shy of 30 years, that a lot of the score gains that have been produced by high-stakes testing are bogus. There really isn't much controversy about that. It's very clear. We know why it's happening, and we know how severe it is. I'm going to show you some evidence about that. But the fact that scores are going up allows everybody to pretend that things are getting better when they're not. And I finally just got fed up with this. And it's not just policymakers who do it. Academics do it all the time as well. So that was one reason. The other is I thought, it would be fun to be able to use honest adjectives for a change. I don't have to say misleading gains. I can say fraudulent gains and bogus gains. I thought that might be fun. So that's why I wrote the book. And the book has 3 parts. For those of you who haven't read it, which I assume is most of you. The first is just a very brief introduction to some principles of testing that you need to understand the rest. The main body of the book, the second part, summarizes the good and bad news that we have about the impact of high-stakes testing for the last 20 or more years. It's mostly bad news, but there is some good news in there as well. And the last part is the part I mentioned at the beginning, a bunch of suggestions both about principles that we might follow in doing things better, and some concrete suggestions about how we might implement those. So let me summarize the news first. The bad news, which is unfortunately much longer list than the good news. The first is absolutely endemic bad test prep. It's absolutely everywhere. I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room about that, but it is absolutely everywhere. The second is badly inflated test scores. New York State is one of the places where that was documented not all that long ago. I'm going to show you 2 graphs of that, one just showing the overall amount of inflation, the other showing that the inflation was worse for disadvantaged kids than for others. The third is cheating. We don't have any idea how much cheating there is because there are over 13,000 school districts and there's no one able to monitor this in 13,000 school districts. And in fact, when people do try to monitor it, in many cases they are pushed aside. Things are covered up as they were in Washington, D.C. But there have been enough accounts and enough major scandals that we know it's common. And everyone knows Atlanta. There's also a big one in El Paso that resulted in felony indictments. There's one in Philadelphia. There are lots and lots and lots of them. The fourth is something that I didn't actually perceive. It's not really researched. It's something that former teachers who come to my school to study started telling me about. And the first time this came up was when students were doing what's now a standard exercise at the end of a course I teach every year. It was the first time I'd done it. I gave them a stack of examples of test prep activities, and I said, I want you to sort them into two bins, good and bad. And good means only one thing. It means if you did this, kids would walk out the door with something they could actually use later. Right? Bad means you're going to produce gains that are specific to that test. And I said, I don't care if it's lousy instruction in other regards, if it's boring, I don't care. If it would leave kids with something valuable, count it as good no matter how boring it is. To quote another former student who was until recently Secretary of Education in Vermont, her term was garden variety lousy teaching. He said, if it looks like garden variety lousy teaching, call it good if it would still leave kids with something valuable. Partway through that exercise, a former Massachusetts math teacher, secondary school math teacher, interrupted the discussion and said, this would make no sense to most of the young teachers I work with. And I was really startled. I said, why not? And she said, because the things that we're now labeling as bad test prep weren't just things that we were told to do. We were told it was good instruction. And the room erupted. People saying, let me tell you what I was told. So a couple of years ago, a student who took that course stayed on to do an independent study or a small seminar where he looked at the books that are most influential in teacher training. And it's there. It's there. People are it's not as it was when I got involved in this field 30 years ago, that experienced teachers would tell me point blank, well, there's my teaching and there's what I do to prepare for tests, but one person at the time called double entry teaching. A lot of young teachers have never seen anything else, and they've been told explicitly to do this. Right? That's what I mean by the corruption of the idea of teaching. And the last, of course, is stress. You are mostly teachers. I don't need to talk to you about this, but I just mentioned one example. When a small group of students were exploring this in more detail after my class ended and we did a seminar for the next semester, one of them noticed that the test administration instructions that are given to teachers and administrators in at least one state have explicit instructions about what to do when kids vomit on their test forms. So I'll leave it at that. So let me give you some examples. So first of all, when people talk about test prep, the conversation often founders right at the beginning, because the advocates of high-stakes testing will say, well, we want test prep. We want tests that are worth teaching to. And the opponents of high-stakes testing use the word test prep to refer to inappropriate or bad test prep. So basically, my simple way of thinking about this is that good test prep is test prep that gives kids real skills and knowledge. And when I was involved in doing the first study that was ever done of score inflation, started in 1988, we found one small district in which we just saw no sign of inflated test scores at all. So at the end, I called the curriculum director for the district and I said, I need to sit down with you for an hour or two and hear what you do with test scores. And it was all exactly what you're supposed to do. He said, well, we might sit down with the teacher and say, well, if your kids' scores are low, can we figure out what kinds of things you're teaching less effectively than others? And once we know that, let's see if we can find some other teachers who have better ways of teaching that material. That's good test prep. Right, the bad test prep is what you can buy at Barnes & Noble. And actually, you don't have to go to Barnes & Noble to buy it anymore. It's test prep that is designed specifically to raise scores on the test used for accountability. And it is absolutely everywhere. So I'm going to show you just a few examples. So first of all, what are the types of what I'm calling bad test prep? The first is something that now is called, when I first used this term, it wasn't I and my colleagues, it was not common, it's pretty common now, reallocation. And that just refers to shifting instructional resources, mostly time, but it can be other things as well, to better align with the tests for which you're being held accountable. And the normal response I get from advocates when I mention this is, what's wrong with that? If the test is testing important material. And what's wrong with that is everything that isn't taught because it's not tested. And there is documentation of this, really horrifying documentation in some cases, going back to the late 1980s. It's nothing new. And it takes two forms. One is simply giving up on subjects that aren't tested. A lot of kids in a lot of places, kids don't know how bills are passed. Why would they have to learn how bills are passed? They're not tested on how bills are passed. Science was one of the first, elementary school science was one of the first casualties of this. The other is reallocating time within a subject. That's really very different. Reallocating time between subjects doesn't inflate test scores. If you put all of your time into math, you may be generating real gains in math. You just have kids who don't know anything about social studies. But when you reallocate within a subject, you often generate fraudulent test score gains. Because what people have in their minds, I'm going to show you an example. When you say kids know more math, is the things that you're not teaching, and this is not you, the things that one is not teaching, as well as the things that one is. So it's a zero-sum game. You have to give up things that you don't have time for in order to put more time on what's tested. My favorite quote is from a secondary school teacher in Boston who was interviewed by some of our students at the tail end of a survey study, a pilot study of survey forms that we were doing. And she came up with the odd statement. She said, "Why would I teach about irregular polygons?" And that really took me back. I thought, why would anybody even ask that question? And then I realized it's because they never show up on the Massachusetts test. Right? So the second kind is coaching. That's a word that's used to mean lots of different things in different places, but I and my colleagues use it to mean focusing on incidental, unimportant details of the test. Right? That's what process of elimination is, for example. It can be focusing on aspects of format, other aspects of the way the test is, the material is presented. It can focus on the truly trivial details of content. I didn't bring any examples of items that show that. It can be the response demands that the kids are faced with. It can be the way things are scored. It doesn't matter. You find things that aren't actually important for the conclusion you're basing on scores, and you focus on those because they raise scores. I'm going to show you some. And the last is cheating. And the argument I make in the book about this is, and I've said this to every single reporter who's called me about a cheating scandal for the last maybe 5 years. I ask them, why are you drawing the line where you're drawing it? They want to treat cheating as changing answer sheets, or things of that sort. And I said, well, let me ask you a harder question. I've said this to many of them. It has had absolutely no effect, by the way, but I've said this over and over. There are kinds of bad test prep that are ambiguous. Sometimes they might produce real gains, sometimes they might produce bogus gains. There are some that can only produce bogus gains. And they're very common. Right? Any of you teach math? Pythagorean triples. Right? So those of you who don't teach math, if you're an item writer and you want to test the Pythagorean theorem, you have a real problem, which is that kids haven't been taught how to compute square roots for 20 years. Well, maybe longer. So if you give kids a Pythagorean theorem problem that requires taking square roots, they're going to get it wrong even if they know the Pythagorean theorem. So you have two options. Put it in the calculator section if you've got one, and if you don't, you use a simple square that kids know. Well, there aren't many triples, leg lengths and hypotenuse lengths, that actually have simple squares. 3, 4, 5 is the most common. 5, 12, 13 is used less often because not that many kids realize that the square of 13 is 269. So Princeton Review tells kids, memorize this ratio, they call it a ratio, this triple or a multiple of it will solve most of the problems you get on the test. They don't have any idea what the Pythagorean theorem is. If you hire one of them to build you a roof, you better hope that it's a 3, 4, 5 roof, or it's going to fall down. They don't know the theorem, but they will get the item right. Okay, that kind of test prep can only produce fraudulent gains in performance. So the question I ask reporters is, can you tell me why that's not cheating? Well, it's an uncomfortable question, but I'm not sure what the answer to that is. All right, so let me show you a couple of examples. This one was actually found by the former student I mentioned, Rebecca Holcomb, who was until recently the Secretary of Education in Vermont. This was on the website of the Quincy, Massachusetts district. It looks like Quincy, like John Quincy Adams, but it sounds Quincy. They had 3 of them, PowerPoint files. Well, actually, it was one file that had 3 forks. The first page had the pictures of the covers of the 3 most commonly used secondary school math texts. When you picked one, you were put into a branch that had a page like this for every chapter of that book. The rows are section numbers, and the links were at the time live links to every released test item that tested that section of that chapter over the previous 4 years. Right? The district put this up. So you could look at this in there's nothing unusual about chapter 7. I think I used chapter 4 in the book. But you can look at this and in a matter of seconds say, well, I don't need to spend time on section 7.5. It's never tested. If you ask math teachers whether they do this, literally since the late 1980s, in surveys and interview studies, they have said, yes, we do. Because our feet are being held to the fire to raise scores. Right? I actually took one of these chapters. It was hard to do because I couldn't find the book. It was out of print by the time I did this. But in writing the book that is the subject of today, I thought, I really ought to go back and look at what these sections are to see whether 7.1, 7.3, 7.5 are unimportant. And I think I did it with chapter 4, but in any case, I couldn't see any difference in the importance of these sections. That's reallocation, and that produces bogus increases in test scores. All right, so coaching. I'm going to pick on the old New York test, the one that disappeared after 2012. The story behind this is that in 2009, it became clear, well, the New York City press for several years before 2009 had stopped believing the good news coming out of the city's education department. And every year when the test scores came out, they would call a few people, including me, and looking for blood. They wanted to hear of malfeasance. But the upshot of this is in 2009, when the national assessment results came out, I'm going to show you a graph of this, and it was clear that the state's national assessment scores were going like this, and the state test scores were going like this. The then Commissioner David Steiner and Merrill Tisch, the Chancellor of the Board of Regents, asked a bunch of people to come to New York City to discuss this. I was one of them. And they actually did, I'll come back to this, they actually did issue a report to the press saying that there's something wrong with the state's test scores. But they asked me to be on the advisory committee, and I said, show me that you're serious about attacking the problem. And when they said, how? I said, give me all of your data. I said, I want every test score that's administered in the state so that I can explore things like whether score inflation is affecting some groups of students more than others and so on. It took 4 months of argument, but I did have, for years, every item administered in the state of New York. So I know these tests pretty well. So this is from the New York State math tests, grade 7 math tests in 2008. I actually don't know why this is on the math tests, but if any of you taught 7th grade, you'll recognize the standard. So I just want you to look at this item. You may think it's a perfectly reasonable item. I sort of did too the first time I saw it. This is the next year. It's the same item. We found 5 of them. We called them in my group the watermelon problems. But the question I give to students is, tell me how you would teach kids to get these items right once you know that they show up almost every year without teaching them the substance. Well, it's pretty easy, right? You have to look for the word mass in the stem, and you have to look for the word scale in an answer. You don't actually need to speak English. You don't need to understand anything about this. That's coaching. If somebody notices this pattern and says, we'll just tell kids to look for a scale whenever they get a question about measuring mass, they'll get it right. All right, here's another. I apologize. This is not too clear because this is a PDF, a scan of a PDF of a test. The first thing I want to point out is the standard itself. Compare numbers written in scientific notation. That standard in itself is an invitation to teach badly. What you want to teach kids to do is to understand and to be able to use scientific notation, not simply to compare a bunch of numbers and say which is biggest. Okay? So I give students the same. Here's another. This is an example, another example from the same standard. This is most unlike. One of the ones that's most unlike this. Most of them actually look like this. This doesn't look like it, but it's the same presentation of material. It's a series of numbers in scientific notation. You have to pick the biggest. So I give to students the same challenge. How can you coach kids to get these problems right without teaching them the math? Anyone want to try it? What would you do? What's the least you could tell? What would you do? So you select the biggest exponent. What if there are two exponents that are the same? Bigger number. Okay, you can do it. You're partway there, but you can do it with less math than that. You don't need to tell people what an exponent is. You tell them to look at the little numbers. Now, I don't know how much of this is done, but I do know that look at the little numbers is more extreme than you usually see in test prep materials. But if you look at test prep materials, you'll see coaching of this sort all the time. Okay? What makes it possible is the tests are predictable. They're predictable partly for technical reasons. It's very hard to measure trends over time if tests look really different every year. But they're also predictable because they're very hard to produce. And in current policy, you have to produce a huge number of them. Every state has different tests. They have to test every grade every year. It's an enormous number of tests, and they're just hard to produce. One of my mentors, H.D. Hoover at the University of Iowa, who was a statistician before he became a psychometrician, used to say that people on the outside looking at the measurement business think that all the fancy math involved in scaling is always the hard part. He said, that's the easy part. The hard part is writing an item. It's very hard. So you get one that works. There's a real incentive to kind of tweak it and use it over again. And that's what test prep people, the people who sell test prep, do. They find those patterns. All right. This is one of my favorites. Some years, it doesn't happen every year, but some years the students in an introductory class I teach every year say, we want to give you our examples. So I brought one. This was actually from Texas, if I'm not mistaken, but it could have been New York because I believe this format is used in New York as well. All right, so I don't know why this is true, but in some places when kids get linear equations in two variables, which is what your math teacher is, 8th grade now? 7th, 8th? Somewhere in there. All right. Oh, early 6th? Okay. They get it in this form. There's no reason why it has to be this form. The choice of letters and symbols is completely arbitrary. It doesn't even have to be letters. When I first learned this in an innovative math program when I was in 5th grade, they were just empty polygons. They didn't be anything, but they're always this. So in that state, the test authors decided to be helpful and make it the same in the test also, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. Right? So what happened is the teachers in her school looked over kids' shoulders to figure out what words corresponded to each symbol, and they made a chart. And this is actually part of what was in that chart. M is the slope or the rate of change. I want you to pay attention to B, which is the intercept. Right? And they told kids to memorize that chart. In fact, some of the teachers told them to write it on the cover sheet of their test. Problem is, you might see a different formula. when they leave secondary school, they will never see y equals mx plus b again. The only time I ever see it is in looking at secondary school curricula and secondary school tests. The most conventional but also completely arbitrary form is this one, where b is the slope, not the intercept. So if you teach kids to memorize, you have to memorize b is the intercept. When they get to college, if they go to college, they'll have no idea what this is. They haven't learned the math. Unfortunately, this is not uncommon. That school, they also, by the way, she had when the testing day came around, the kids in her class asked her where the M&Ms were, and she thought she said, "Well, no, I don't have any M&Ms." And she thought that the previous teacher used them as a motivational tool, but she hadn't. She had color-coded the answers. So the kid was having trouble, and I don't know what color was what, I don't remember. Red was an A, and the kid was having a problem with the difficulty, and it was supposed to be an A. She dropped a red M&M to motivate the student. That's a different story. All right, so those are just a few examples. I could give you lots more. They're all horrible, but they're very, very common. And they're encouraged. By the way, I'll tell one quick anecdote. I know everybody's hungry, so I want time for discussion, so I won't go on too long. But I'm very interested in the Dutch system, which is a very decentralized system that, among other things, relies on inspections. And a Dutch colleague of mine who studied inspections when she was in graduate school, I got permission to follow the so-called quality reviewers in New York City, who are basically inspectors. She got permission to shadow some of them for 6 months. She wanted to see what they were doing. And I said, well, will you do me a favor? I would like you to look for 2 other things besides what's on your list. Do they look for bad test prep? And if they find it, do they do anything to counter it? And a few months later, she sent me an email with an attachment saying, well, no, they distribute bad test prep. And what she sent me was something a commercial firm had produced as a loss leader for more expensive test prep that did basically what my research group had done. They went through the state tests, all the released items, year by year, and they put together a compendium, standard 7 and 7, here are all the items, and they passed it out. The inspectors passed it out. All right, this is the graph I mentioned to you. This is the one that got lots of my students' dissertation papers. This is New York's state's scores on the 8th grade math test, the now defunct one that was introduced in 2009 and was replaced by the Common Core test in 2013, I think. All right. So the scale won't be familiar to many of you. It's in fractions of the standard deviation, but if you know test data, you don't need the red line. The blue line is the state test score. And if you know test data, you can look at that blue line and say, this is not real. Right? On a large scale, say a whole state or even a very large district, it's very unusual, in fact, it's almost unheard of to see scores on an uncorrupted test improve or deteriorate by more than 0.05 of a standard deviation a year. This went up 0.6 of a standard deviation in 3 years. So, I mean, it just couldn't be true. But the real kicker was that in the fall of 2009, the National Assessment released borrowed copies of state-level results, and the state got the state-level results. There were city results from New York City as well. But several of you heard the story earlier. David Steiner, who was the new commissioner at the time, and Merrill Tisch asked a bunch of us to come to New York to discuss this. And they wanted to know how to compare the 2 tests and what to say. And I said, well, the first thing you have to do is put them on the common scale so you can line them up and see which is going up faster. That's what this graph is. Well, the red line is going up pretty much at the rate I just described. Perfectly credible. It's a national assessment. So this is another thing I ask students, who's right? Joel Klein said, the state test measures what we consider important. Therefore, the blue line is what we should believe and tell parents, and I don't care about the national assessment. Okay. David Steiner And Merrill Tisch wrote a press release saying that this graph shows that something is fundamentally wrong with the state's testing program. They can't both be right. Well, Joe Klein was dead wrong. To be able to say that credibly, you'd have to be able to go to parents and say, well, you know, when we talk about kids learning more math, including your kids, we don't mean anything that's on the National Assessment of Educational Progress unless it happens to be on our test as well. Which in 8th grade means, for instance, no data analysis at all. But you can't make that argument credibly. And it turns out, by the way, that what was happening in New York State is the national assessment scores were only going up in algebra. There are 5 content strands in the national assessment. And the reason is because the coordinate geometry and algebra were about at that point 80% of the state test. So that's what kids were learning. They weren't learning the rest. All right, this is an example of score inflation. There aren't too many of them because I can tell you from very bitter experience, when you go to see a superintendent or a commissioner and you say, I'd like access to your data to see whether your scores are inflated, they don't say, wow, we've been waiting for you to come. They usually just tell you no. Sometimes they do worse than that. Sometimes they let you get partway done and then throw you out. I've had that happen. My favorite line was a state I went to, at the same time I went to New York, asking for permission to do the work I was then doing, starting in 2009. The assessment director said, it's just not our priority now. That's the common response. So there aren't too many studies, but the studies that have been done are very consistent. This is a particularly bad example, but it's by no means unique. It is very common to see scores on the accountability test increase 3 to 5 times as fast as scores on anything else. And sometimes there are really rapid increases in the accountability test and no improvement on anything else, none whatsoever. So I'll give you 2 other examples of this. And then we can get to the nicer part, which is what to do. This is really old. This is from the 1990s. There are 2 reasons I keep going back to this study. One is just that it's the Kentucky system in the early 1990s was the precursor of No Child Left Behind. It was the first state, Kentucky was the first state to implement a pay or punish system in which the rapidity of score gains in your school led to real cash or punishment. Millions of dollars were spent this way. Curious was the state test for which people were accountable. The National Assessment, NAEP, was the state's own sample, state representative sample. And this is also on the same scale as the previous one. It doesn't matter what that scale is. What matters is it's the same scale for both tests. And what you can see is that the scores on the state test went up about 3.5 times as fast as the same kids' scores on the national assessment. Now, why is this important, this particular example? First of all, the legislature, in enacting the legislation that created that program, made it a requirement that the state's test score reflect the content frameworks of the national assessment. So there was no way to do a Joel Klein. The other reason I use this is there were no multiple choice questions on that test. So one of the common misconceptions that started popping up in the early 1990s when studies of score inflation started appearing is, well, it's because of multiple choice tests. And it is true that multiple choice tests give you a few extra ways to coach, like process of elimination. But I suspected that performance assessments, if they're also predictable, would be just as coachable, which turned out to be true. And in the case of math, it was because the tasks were relatively few in number, therefore, and very memorable. In reading, it was a real puzzle. There was enormous score inflation in reading, which is very uncommon. And I just couldn't figure it out. I went through with a research assistant every single reading item that had been administered in that state. We just couldn't see what was coming. I mean, the format was the same, but there would be long prompts, like a page and a half, followed by a bunch of questions, and the prompts were completely different every year. And finally, a colleague of mine, Ryan Stetcher, who at the time I thought was really the best person in the country in terms of studying teachers' testing, said, you're looking at the wrong thing. In the case of a test like this, what teachers are coaching is the rubric, not the content. So that's why I show this this example. It's not an argument against performance assessment. It's simply a warning that performance assessment isn't enough to get you out of this bind. All right, this one is a very simple example of something that my students and I have started to work on over the last few years. There's a lot of research. It isn't terribly good because the response rates are very poor often, suggesting that disadvantaged kids get worse test prep than advantaged kids, which fits with commonplace observation. That's what you'd expect, given that in our system, the schools at the bottom have the most difficult task in front of them in terms of the increase in scores they have to produce. But we didn't until recently have any evidence that score inflation was actually worse for disadvantaged kids. But the few studies that have been done all say that it's true. And this is a very simple one. Actually, the first one was done a long time ago. It was in so-called Texas Miracle that helped elect George Bush. But this is New York. This is the same data as that, simply broken out by race. And actually just black-white. All right, so the solid lines, well, I'll gesture. I actually redid this slide and forgot to put the new one in, make it a little easier to see. The solid lines are the increases in scale scores for whites and blacks. Whites are the blue line, blacks are the, I think what I was thinking that was called burnt umber in the Crayola box. All right, the key thing is, look at the size of that gap and the size of this gap. I realized that this wasn't so clear, so I put the brackets on to show you, but it shrank a lot. The black-white gap shrank by about a quarter in 3 years on the state test. All right, now to put that in context, again, if you study test score data, there's context in this. People have been looking at, and I have been looking at trends in racial ethnic gaps for a long, long time. And the black-white gap has been narrowing, slowly and erratically, but nonetheless consistently across data sources since the late 1960s. But it doesn't do this. You don't see a quarter of it disappear in 3 years. So look at the national assessment, which is the dotted lines, and you'll see a very slight narrowing of the gap. That's consistent with all other data. It's happening, but it's happening slowly. What this means is that the scores of black students in New York were more, on a state test, were more inflated, more severely inflated than the scores of white kids. Now, that ought to really bother you because, for a number of reasons. One is that the rationale for test-based accountability for the last, well, really since NCLB, has been equity. We're told we have to live with this system because this is what's going to finally close achievement gaps. It doesn't. It creates an illusion of closing achievement gaps. Right? That's truly, in my view, truly disturbing. That's part of the pretext that led me to write this book. It's very comforting to look at lines like the New York lines and say, look how quickly we're solving this long-standing inequity. But we're not solving it that quickly. And it's not just black kids who are experiencing this. Poor kids in general are. It's kids in disadvantaged schools. And in fact, we have some research that one of my most gifted doctoral students I've ever worked with did a study that she's been unable to get published. The reviewers just don't, it's technically very good, reviewers don't like the finding, I think. But what she found, using Texas data, was that it wasn't just poor kids who had more score inflation. It was kids in high poverty schools. So within a school, poor kids got the short end of it, right? Poor kids, if you just restricted the analysis to within school, poor kids had more score inflation than wealthier kids. But the big predictor was how many poor kids were in the school. And that's because score inflation and bad test prep are basically teacher and school level decisions, not kid level decisions, right? So if a school has problems meeting its targets because it's got a lot of poor kids, they have an incentive to do a lot of test prep, and they do. So that's some of the bad news. Is there good news? There actually is. It's not as good as the proponents argue. It's kind of remarkable, actually, that after beating people up with reading test scores for now, depending on the state, 20 or 30 years, reading scores really barely budged. Math scores have, and what the proponents will point to is an increase in 4th grade math scores on the national assessment. And that increase has been really fast. It's one of the fastest increases we've ever seen. However, there are a couple of flies in the ointment, which I spell out in the book. The first is that we have only 3 trustworthy, uncorrupted sources of trend data for 4th grade math, and only one of them shows increases that big. The others show increases, but about 60% as big. The second is we have no evidence that those gains last. We have only 2 sources of data for high school kids, and neither of them show improvements. The gains apparently vanish by the time kids get out of high school. The third goes back to reallocation. We have data going back to 1988 saying that schools have been taking time out of everything else to dump it into math. My favorite was a school in Texas where a music class, it was labeled music class, was remedial math. That's what they used that time slot for. So some portion of those gains in elementary school math represent basically robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking achievement out of other subjects, putting it into math. We don't know how much. That really is the sum total of the good news. I'm being a little flippant, a little too casual. There are a few little things around the edges, but in terms of the main storyline, that's sort of it. So what we've gotten in return for all of these other problems is big gains in mathematics in 4th grade that don't last and probably reflect in part achievement taken from other subjects. In my view, that doesn't warrant the price we've had to pay, the harms we've had to endure. So I'm perfectly comfortable, most of my colleagues are not, saying we can call a game. This reform has failed. And it's time for the sake of kids to think about what else to do. So what else to do? It's pretty much time for me to turn it to all of you, but let me quickly go through a few of these. I'll tell you an anecdote which is in the book. When Arnie Duncan was first installed, a colleague of mine arranged a series of meetings for him and his staff, and I was asked to go to one about testing. And I don't know what I was saying, but to provoke this, but one of his staff members at one point turned to me and said, "What the hell do you mean when you keep referring to other important stuff?" And I said, "I mean what I want to see when I walk into the classroom. You can't rationally hold teachers accountable until you can tell me what you want them to do." And my list of things that I looked at when I went into classrooms to try to pick classes for my kids, which you weren't supposed to do in the district where my kids went, I did it anyway. I looked, sure, the test scores were nice to know, but that's really not what I was looking for. I was looking for really engaging instruction, high level of cognitive demand, motivation on the part of students, and so on. And I have in the book, by the way, the story that I gave them of a teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland, north of Padilla. I won't give you the whole story now, it takes too long, but she was, I taught 4th grade once, so I have a basis for saying this, the best elementary school math teacher I have ever encountered. When I went to visit classrooms, to argue about where I wanted my kids, I always made sure I watched math because math is often taught poorly. And I was just in awe of this teacher. She had before every regular math class something she called math lab. It was more of a math log. There's more of a description in the book. But basically it was one problem. Kids worked partly in groups, partly alone. It was about 15 minutes. And they had to turn in a log. These are 4th graders. It was graded for logic and thoroughness, but it was not graded for correctness. She did not want students to worry about mistakes. The day I was there, she asked, which is stronger, a rectangle or a triangle? So, how about the hand shot up. Miss Fia, what do you mean by stronger? Oh, you thought, wow, this is good. Good start. So she said, well, you could define it differently. I said, I mean, which would hold more weight? If I gave you weights to pile on top, which would collapse? First, that's the weaker one. More hubbub. And they, of course, all thought rectangles were stronger. So she asked for answers, and lot of people say, oh, rectangles, rectangles. So she passed out little shapes made of, I don't know what those pins are called, those like cotter pins you can use them in classrooms. Cardboard strips are held in the corner. And said, play with these for a few minutes, see what you think. And there was this enormous hubbub in the room. And then she said, who is wrong? Hands were waving. Kids eager to talk about being wrong. And then she said, this is what actually just knocked my socks off. These were fourth graders. She said, would anyone like to try to explain the mistake? There was silence and then some tentative hands went up. Just awe-inspiring math instruction. So I gave this story to Ernie Duncan, and I said, can you tell me that what you're going to dump into schools will encourage that kind of teaching? There was sort of awkward silence in the room. And I said, okay, well, let's make it a little easier. Can you promise me you won't discourage that kind of teaching? But he did discourage that kind of teaching. You'd have to be nuts to do that because you're taking 15 minutes away from drilling kids for tests. So that's paying attention to other important things. Setting reasonable targets. I'm not going to go through all of these because I really do want time for people to ask questions and to raise objections and so on. Setting reasonable targets. We set targets in this country out of thin air. I don't know if any of you have been involved in this process, but the first stage is you set performance standards. That's sketchy enough, frankly. But the procedure for doing that has nothing to do with any kind of evidence about how fast good teaching can improve performance. So they get these standards where people make up ideas about what constitutes proficient, and then somebody says, here's how many years you get to take to get there. You're going to have to get there. And in some cases, I've seen systems where the required improvement was 6 and 7 times as fast as we have ever seen in the real world. Right? Well, what are you going to do? If you're faced with targets like that, you can fail, you can cut corners, or you can cheat. There are no other options. Right? You can't improve performance by 2/10 or 3/10 of the standard deviation a year. No one can. Right? So we have to set targets based on reasonable goals. We have to figure out what is reasonable to expect teachers to do differently, and we can't make them annual. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've now taught almost every grade from 4th grade through doctoral studies, and I never assume that if I change something, I'll get it right the first time. 2 years if I'm lucky, 3 years I can sort of count on. So we need to set moderate-term reasonable targets for teachers, or we're going to be telling teachers to misbehave. Counterbalancing incentives. This is something I thought was a real insight of mine when I was writing the book. I was very pleased with myself, and then I had a dim memory of reading about it in a paper by 2 British economists 10 years earlier, so it's not my idea. But they pointed out, they were talking about the British healthcare system and the accountability system that Tony Blair put onto that, which is very similar to No Child Left Behind in a lot of ways. And they said what it imitated, the proponents say, we're trying to bring business strategies to the public sector. And their answer was nonsense. What you're bringing to the public sector is the kind of incentive system that's used in the social industrial system, where every single person from the bottom to the top has the same goal, increasing one number. Nobody has an incentive to worry about how you're improving the number. And some of the stories I heard as a kid, which turns out I think were apocryphal, but there actually is a scholarly literature documenting the remarkably stupid things that people did in response to that. And my favorite, there are many of them, but my favorite was that for a while, shoe factories were held accountable just for the number of shoes they produced. And one year, leather got really expensive. It's a problem. So what could you do? Well, in one factory, they figured, we'll just make small shoes. And they did. Nobody bought them. But they made lots of small shoes because they don't take much leather. Okay? There are lots of examples of this. We have a system in which nobody is given incentive to go into a classroom and ask how our scores are being used. Principals ought to be doing it. The principals face the same pressure as everybody else. Superintendents should be asking people to do it, but they lose their jobs if scores don't go up fast enough. Everybody wants rapid increases in scores. We need to have a system where there's some countervailing incentives, where somebody who matters has an incentive to go in and look at what's going on. That's why I like the Dutch inspectorate system. Monitor, evaluate, and revise. One of the reasons that the pretense has gone on so long is that people can say, well, look, scores are going up. It must be working. Right? That's obviously not right. This is an example. There's a time now to go into it if someone asked about what's called Campbell's Law. It's a very widespread phenomenon. If you hold people accountable for one numerical indicator, what you get is a corruption of the process you're trying to improve. The only way to do this right is to look at what changes in schools when you impose a new system. That means a lot of work, right? But you have to do that if you want to try something really new and and be willing to make mid-course corrections if you really want it to work in the long term. We were having a side conversation before about Rick Mills, who before he came here and instituted high stakes testing, had an entirely different life in Vermont, where he instituted a portfolio system statewide. And he had a lot of external people advising him. I was one. And one of the pieces of advice I gave him, which he took, is I said, look, if anybody tells you they know how this is going to work out, don't believe them. We don't have a clue how this is going to work out, and you need to tell people to be prepared for the fact that you may need to make some changes. So he did. He went around the state saying, we have to be prepared to make mid-course corrections. We're going to get some of it wrong. I'm going to invite outsiders in to monitor what's happening so we can make changes. That's what we should be doing. We expect it with airline safety, with car safety, with drug safety. Why not schools? It should be even more true of schools because kids aren't even old enough to give informed consent. By the way, side here. In the United States, data is considered pretty much the private sandbox of the people at the top. Right? Now, part of this is the federal law FERPA, which makes it very difficult to share data. But it was a problem long before FERPA. So what happens is in many cases you can't monitor because the people on the top don't want you to monitor. Right? So imagine if, for some of you are too young to remember this, but quite some years ago, it turns out that post-approval monitoring of some kinds of anti-inflammatory drugs, these Celebrex and Vioxx, COX-2 inhibitors are called, caused cardiac problems in a modest number of patients if they were used for a length of time. And this was found out because it's expected that even after FDA approval, there will be monitoring effects of drug use. Imagine what would have happened if the CEO of that company had told the people in public health what the testing director in Massachusetts told me, sorry, that's not our priority now. It's an ethical issue that really disturbed me. The information about what's happening to kids in public schools ought to be public. This next one, stop kicking the dog harder. That's something that Linda Darling Hammond said many years ago when high stakes testing was just starting. She said, it's the kick the dog harder notion of school reform. The idea is teachers know exactly what they should do, they're just being withholding. And if we kick them hard enough, they'll finally do what we want them to do. Well, that's nuts. I mean, the problems that arise, your teachers mostly, I don't need to tell you, but that's simply nuts. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we don't see many schools performing the way we want them to, and failing to kick the dog harder is not one of them. Pay attention to context. What states want is numbers that they can purportedly interpret in the state capital without ever seeing your school. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And for example, Dan and I had a side conversation about this because I was on the panel that reviewed the consortium schools many years ago. But one of the consortium schools was serving mostly immigrant kids who were not native speakers of English, and many of them were kids who immigrated when they were older. So they're having a much harder time learning the language than people who immigrated before. And so their performance on written test wasn't very good. They didn't speak English. So, but from the state perspective, you look at the scores from that school, and it looks just like a school that, say, has native-speaking kids with high transients, or teachers who checked out, or who knows what. It all looks the same. It doesn't work. You have to spend the time and money and work to look at context. And the last is the most controversial. I want to end with this because I think this is really something that's very arguable. I don't think we can have a sensible way of evaluating schools without trusting human judgment. I just don't think it can be done. And if you look at systems that are really successful, many of them do rely intensively on human judgment. Singapore, for instance, and the Netherlands, which are dramatically different systems, both high performing, rely intensively on human judgment. We don't. Right? And there are a number of reasons, some historical, some not, why we don't. Right? One of them is that the evaluation system in public schools when I was a teacher simply didn't work. It didn't. I mean, unless you did something that was morally offensive or embezzled or whatever, there really wasn't an effective accountability system based on the principal judgments in many places. It wasn't where I was. The second is that human judgment is necessarily fallible. People don't necessarily agree, even if they're trained. There's some unreliability in it. There's a risk of bias. The third thing is that it's harder to do in a public employment situation than in a private one. This was something that was pointed out to me by an economist who works in the same area some years ago. If I were a mid-level manager in a private firm, and Adam was one of the people working for me, and he was not doing really much at all, but I really liked him, I would have a strong incentive not to follow my gut and give him a positive evaluation because I'm losing money, and that's going to affect my evaluation. There's money on the table. In public employment, there's not. So it's harder to get people to do good evaluations. That's why in the Dutch system, and actually the British system, some of the evaluations done by people outside the school, by professional evaluators. All of these problems are very real. I don't want to belittle them. It's not going to be easy to come up with a way to use judgment in a way that's really effective. But I just don't see a way around it. I mean, when I have gone into classrooms, what's motivated me to say, I will not put my kid there, I really want her there, are things that involve human judgment. So I had hoped when I wrote the book, this was not what happened, is that people would say, well, the evidence is the evidence, okay, we have to accept that. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about ways that we can do some of this, which ways are likely to be more successful and less successful. And I think the odds are we'll get it wrong some of the time. We will. But I think this is the path we need to follow if we really want to serve kids. So let me leave it there. I talked longer than I had meant, and you haven't eaten. So let's use some time for questions and arguments and so on. There was a Jerry Springer style microphone.
That was the first test. Can you find the microphone? Thank you so much, Dr. Koretz, for your presentation. Now we have about 30 minutes, or as long as we have questions and conversation. There are 3 microphones up front here, and we would welcome questions for our keynoter, responses, arguments, provocations. And you're not getting out early just because nobody comes with a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. A lot of stuff that really makes sense. My name is Vicki Robertson. I'm a parent in City School District. And one thing when I come to these things, and it all makes so much sense, but then I talk with friends who they're so frustrated with the district and with the real issues and problems and the urgency. And I tell them, we've got to fix things, but it's going to take time and all the kinds of things you said. And they're like, but we don't have time. And I just wonder if you could address that tension with the urgency of the problem. Yeah.
Well, it's very frustrating. When No Child Left Behind was passed, maybe the year after it was enacted, the woman who then ran our programs in professional education came to see me and she said, I want you to do a workshop for principals to tell them how they can cope with No Child Left Behind. So I thought about it for a week and I went to see her and I said, I can't do it. They're screwed. I can't think of any way out of this. There isn't a short-term fix. There really isn't. I mean, this way of doing things has become so habitual that it's very hard to get a serious discussion in the policy world about serious changes. And I actually think this is going to sound perhaps hackneyed. There are 42 million school children in the United States, something like that. Their parents are a lot of voters. I really think that's the only solution. I think you have to use political. It's slow. Political work is slow and it's really boring in many cases. But I think until there's enough political pressure, it's not going to change. I'm sorry, that's a frustrating answer, but I just really have been beating my head against the wall for years with this. And you know, when I first started presenting evidence about score inflection, it was really kind of puzzling because policymakers would ask me to come and present. And I would present, but they didn't want to hear it. I don't know why they invited me. And the response was sort of, well, that's really interesting, but we have a job to do. And the notion is that if we stop doing this, schools will fail. So I think it's going to be a tough slog. We have to start getting local candidates who are serious about more sensible ways of organizing schools. In some cases, it's more than school boards; it's legislators. Fuck you. That's, I think, the only path.
And I would add that in addition to that, not in lieu of that, we really have to accelerate our efforts to produce, to demonstrate more compelling ways of assessing learning, performance-based. I believe that half of all the objections that teachers have to the current testing would disappear if the tests actually ask students to demonstrate what they're able to do with what they're learning, rather than just repeat or pick the right answer. So there are good examples of that in the Coalition of Central Schools and some of our schools, such as School Without Walls in Rochester, and some other performance-based approaches, project-based approaches to education.
If I could just add to that, there was an idea that, this may be impractical, I don't know, but it was an idea that was going around in Vermont when the portfolio system was in place. I think that the name was School Achievement Days, something like that. But the idea was that schools should have some number of days when parents could come in and see the most exciting work the kids are doing. Not something like science fairs, which are, well, you know what science fairs are. But real work, so a kid could say, this is the most exciting thing I've done in science this year, this is the most exciting thing I've done in that this year. And people would get credit for, teachers would get credit for doing that because the parents would say, well, that's really nifty. It wouldn't be abstract, it would be something really concrete. I don't know if it's practical to do that or not. It never got off the ground in Vermont.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
So hopefully this will be a brief response. My question is, as I kind of leave the profession after about 35 years, what are your thoughts on two things? I've seen assessments, many of us have, for years that are quite unethical, in my opinion. And what I'm talking about is our population is becoming more and more diverse, and we're also seeing more and more students labeled, if that's the term, disabled, have some sort of disability. And what I'm getting at is, I find what we're doing as a society, or specifically our country, unethical in terms of not being culturally sensitive towards students that come to this country as ELLs, English language learners, with limited skills from their own country for various reasons, as well as all of the students that have disabilities that we over-test mod. For example, we rephrase test questions, and et cetera, and then they pass artificially, quite frankly, when many of the other students should be identified too and get the same luxury of having second location, et cetera, So those two kind of bother me when I think about, and when I hear about tests are here to stay, and then I hear what Adam says, which I've always thought would be much more valid, which is project-based assessments, portfolio assessments, based on individual needs and learning styles. So, thoughts?
Well, this is a dangerous territory, but as a former special ed teacher, I'll venture into it. I'm really distressed by what's happened with kids with disabilities. It really started in the 1990s when there was a real push to include kids with disabilities in standards-based reform. And it was entirely well motivated. I mean, the idea was that school districts were in many cases basically putting these kids in the basement. Nobody was paying attention to whether they were really learning anything. And the advocates were arguing, I think reasonably, that something had to be done to make school districts, the ones that weren't, some were, but the ones that weren't paying attention, these kids pay attention. And the solution was give them the same test as everybody else. And I was on a panel for the National Research Council, looked at that back in the late 1990s. And frankly, I think the report was a cop-out. I mean, basically, we don't know how to properly assess some kids with disabilities. That's the real answer. Right? So in the case of somebody who has a visual disability, we sort of know what to do. It doesn't work perfectly, by the way. We can use oral presentation, we can use Braille, in some cases you can use enlarged type in dim rooms, there are a bunch of things you can do because the disability is unrelated to what you're trying to test. And there's an example in my first book of a student in my own class who's actually the impetus for better accommodations at Harvard because of her problems. But most kids who are labeled as having disabilities under IDEA, Section 504, don't have things like hearing disabilities or visual disabilities. Those are minute. It's mostly learning disabilities, speech disabilities, behavior disorder, and so on. Learning disabilities are an extraordinarily hard problem. Right? And I'll give you a concrete example. I don't know that performance assessment will solve this problem either. I mean, the way the feds tried to solve it is they give them some alternate assessment that somehow is testing the same thing. But here's the problem that we struggled with in 1997, and I don't think we've answered it yet. Right now, most math tests deliberately embed mathematics in real-world contexts. Right? That's deliberate. There are a bunch of reasons. It's not. There are things you lose by doing that, but it's not an accident that that's done. Right? That means words. Right? That means a lot of dyslexic kids who are good in math will do terribly on the test. So what's the solution? You could give a test that divorces math from language more, but then the tests wouldn't be realistic. Some of the old-fashioned tests, like the ITBS, do that. Iowa Test of Basic Skills do that. Another thing you could do, nobody wants to do, is say, all right, we actually can't answer that question for those kids, so we have to test them differently and test the parts of mathematics that we can pull out from language. But that's testing them differently, which is not legal right now. So the phrase in that report was that doing this properly was beyond current technology. That was the phrase. What it really meant is we didn't have a clue. We just don't know how to do this well. ELLs are a different problem because that ideally is something that decreases over time. The problem is it doesn't go away. You know, a lot of the states now have this rule that after X amount of time, you can pretend that a kid isn't a non-native speaker, which I think is, I suspect that people who've written those rules have never lived someplace where they're not a native speaker. I have. It takes more than a year, and it takes a long time. But, thank you. Go ahead.
I would like you to address a couple of concerns that I've had about the testing movement as a tool for dodging some fundamental influences that have damaged education. The first is, I think that testing has been used in the last number of decades to avoid attention towards and demands for greater resources for schools and for youngsters and their families. That instead of providing adequate funding, testing and controlled curriculum have been identified as the answers. And secondly, I think that what testing has done is serve as a tool to reduce teacher power in classrooms and in schools with respect to the curriculum, with respect to what teachers are able to teach, what students are able to think, and that has been an issue that begins in the 1960s when there was a great rejection of teacher power that began in the free schools, open classrooms, whole language, and so on and so forth. And so there's a whole ideological component to this, it seems to me, in controlling the power of teachers and what students are able to think about in classrooms.
I entirely agree with you. And I think one of the problems we're up against is that the policy world, by and large, doesn't trust teachers in this country. That's not true in all countries, but that's true in this country. There are a lot of people who are making decisions about education who do not trust teachers. And they use testing as one way to take control. But with respect to not essentially taking the cheap way out, that's what I meant by don't expect schools to do it all. The notion is, policymakers had is, this is kind of like controlling sulfur dioxide emissions. We just give people targets and they'll figure out how to do it. And I once asked one deputy commissioner who was really pushing test-based accountability, I said, well, you're asking for enormous improvements in performance in very disadvantaged communities, in his state, communities where a lot of people aren't even literate. And he said, teachers know how to do it. But I had one kid when I was a teacher who came in with cigarette burns on his arms. The problem he faced was not that I wasn't facing test-based accountability. The problem was that he just wasn't in a position to pay attention to what was going on in school. So I think that the notion that we can somehow ignore the social context of education, ignore the fact that an appalling number of American kids are living in poverty, and an appalling number of living in neighborhoods that are very, say, not conducive to good work in schools, a lot of violence in some neighborhoods and so on. It's just inexcusable. I just agree with you. I agree with you entirely.
Hello, hi, I'm Pamela, and I'm a parent of 3 children in the city school district. And I'm just curious about your last point there, accept the need for human judgment. I have, as a parent, I've opted my children out of many state tests, and when I talk to other parents about it, often I'll get the response, you shouldn't do that, it's gonna ruin the school, the scores will go down. How else are we going to judge our schools? How will parents know what school to put their child in if we don't have these tests? And that last point there is something that's sort of dear to my heart, but I'm curious from you, if you have an example of human judgment, using human judgment.
I hate to reduce it to anecdote, but let me give you some anecdotes. My kids went to school in the highest performing school cluster in the state of Maryland. In my neighborhood, most of the parents were biomedical researchers at NIH, economists at the World Bank. The fact is, you could have locked those kids in the basement all day and they would have scored well. Because what happened is that if the kids had a bad teacher, the parents either retaught it, that's what I did, or they hired tutors. I found this out when my son and one of his good friends were split up in 10th grade. The friend's father said, "This is terrible. Noah and Jonathan aren't in the same math class. They can't study together anymore." I said, "Yeah, it's too bad, because they really studied together well." He looked at me and said, "You don't understand, do you?" I said, "What do you mean?" "Sure, I understand. They studied together all the time." He said, No. They would get together after school. If they couldn't figure it out, Noah would go and ask me to teach it to him after dinner, and then he'd call Jonathan and explain it. He said, "Now I have to learn this stuff." So the point is, there were teachers in that school that absolutely everybody knew shouldn't be there. There were also teachers who were spectacular, and they were treated exactly the same. Right? Nobody acted on the judgment and said, "Okay, this person ought to be teaching other people how to do stuff because she's so good. This person really needs help because she's doing things she shouldn't be doing." Everybody knew it, but nobody could act on judgment. The scores were good, there weren't behavioral problems, so The typical answer when a parent would raise that in that district was, I heard this so many times I thought maybe people were taught to say it. I'm sure what you saw is not typical. You know, I saw my son was in a third grade class, which was just incredibly disruptive. The kids were just climbing the walls. So I went in to watch. The teacher was fine with me coming in, and they were bored. So one of the things I watched was math lessons, and they were all the same. Kids would get worksheets with no, what they call in Germany, cognitive activation. They had no idea why they were doing this. Right? They would do the worksheet, they'd be collected, and they would discuss them. So they were bored teachers. I watched 6 of them. And they're all the same. And the principal said, I'm sure what you saw wasn't typical. What I was going to say, my wife said, I was going to say, well, all right, if she does it randomly half the time, then that's 0.5 to the 6th power. So that's pretty unlikely. That was the standard answer. So I think, you know, when you see something good going on in a classroom, people ought to be empowered to respond to that. And they're not.
So let me add to that another use of human judgment that would improve assessments, and that is to take the same attitude towards assessments that we take towards learning. We all see the value of personalizing learning, that is creating learning or with the student in mind, student-centered learning. And yet, we take the opposite view for assessments, where you set one standard, which is too high for some and too low for others. And probably the most unrealistic way to do assessments. If we use human judgment, we would then make standards a reach for each student, but at the same time within the reach.
Yeah, exactly.
So if a student is here, we would set a standard here so that we would increase the likelihood of success and diminish the likelihood of failure if we set the standard here. That's an invitation for failure. So this does not mean lower expectations. It means that we would do in school what we do in life. If I play tennis and I want to learn to be a better tennis player, I would not play with the Wimbledon champion, because the only exercise would be for my neck. I would play with someone who's somewhat better than me. And then once I am competitive with that person, I would play with someone who would be a reach for me, but within reach. That kind of individualized assessment is not possible without the human judgment or professional discretion by the educator.
If I can give a concrete example of that, when I was a teacher, I had a small number of kids who were in 5th and 6th grade who were reading, so I don't remember exactly now, it was a long time ago, we were probably around the 2nd grade level. And to be frank, I was not a good reading teacher, but let's say I had to. How would you judge the success of my work? Well, you wouldn't find out whether I was doing well or poorly by giving them the 6th grade test and seeing if they were proficient. Of course they weren't. So you doing that and not using enough judgment to say, well, these kids are way behind, so let's give them a test that's a little bit ahead of where they are. There was no way to tell whether I was good or bad. There would have been in the credit system, no way to tell whether I was good or bad.
Thank you, Candice.
I know this is a huge issue, but do you see any relationship between the hegemony of the testing movement in the last, especially 20 years, and what's going on politically, especially the disdain for any kind of expertise?
Well, I think that's a shifting target. Right? I don't know if you followed the passage of No Child Left Behind, but it was politically very interesting because the most vocal, or not most vocal, the most prominent liberals in both houses supported Bush's bill. Right? And the reason they did was I think very clear. I was in a meeting where George Miller, who was kind of Teddy Kennedy's equivalent in the House in that debate, was asked, why did you support this bill? And he said, to shed light in the corners. He said, and it was entirely an equity argument in his mind. He said, we have allowed school districts to get off, and schools to get off the hook because they do well with high-performing kids, even if they do terribly with low-performing kids. This is going to force them to do well with low-performing kids. It didn't, of course. That coalition obviously disintegrated. So at this point, I think a lot of it is, I may be wrong, but I think a lot of it is habit. I mean, the debate has been, there hasn't been a serious debate in the policy world about whether it's sensible to drive educational reform using high-stakes tests in decades. It's everybody, they all talk about variations of that. So that, I mean, the big issue, one of the big issues when ESSA was being debated was simply whether it was sensible and necessary to test in every grade. Not should we be driving instruction with tests, but should we test in fewer grades. So I don't know whether it has anything to do with disparagement of expertise in general. It certainly has to do with the disparagement of teaching expertise. That I think is crystal clear.
Thank you, please.
Yes, first I'd like to thank you for your presentation tonight. Even if one agrees that reform by high-stakes testing isn't an effective way, most of the comparisons we hear about are international comparisons, how they do it better in Singapore, or how people do it better in Finland. And I'm wondering, given all your experience and observations around this country, if you could just point us to either at a state level or at a district level, somebody who's doing it well.
Well, in this country, there isn't a lot of freedom to do it well.
Right.
I mean, the problem is there are a lot of people in districts around the country who are chafing at the restraints they're under and are trying to do things better, but there isn't much leeway. But you can't assume that you could take the Dutch system or the Singaporean system and drop it into Trenton. That's right. It would work the same way. But I really do think it's worth looking at what other countries do, and if nothing else, picking from those examples, things that we ought to try. And they may work, they may not, they may need modification. But a couple of us were talking before the session. I'm really intrigued by the Dutch system because it's a choice-oriented system. Under the Dutch Constitution, anybody can set up a school. Some schools are run by local districts, some are not. Right? But it's sort of the opposite of a Betsy DeVos style choice system, in that every school has to present public information of all sorts. Every school is open to the inspectorate, which is independent. So there's this very interesting mix of external monitoring with professional judgment at the school level.
I guess what I'm asking though, Dan, is there any place in the United States where somebody's been politically able to make a change that you've seen, and can you tell us any that you've seen? Because I do get there's a lot of nice models in the world, but how about here, anything moving ahead that you've seen?
I haven't seen anything dramatically different because there isn't much room. There are places that are trying, beginning to try things. New Hampshire has gotten a waiver to try new kinds of assessment systems and so on, but they're just, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I just went through recently, quickly, a summary of the approved ESSA plans. And my impression, and maybe people in the room know more about those plans than I do, is that they're very disappointing. ESSA doesn't give states much of the autonomy back. It gives them some autonomy back. Most of them don't seem to be doing very much with it.
Dan Dermasic, can I call on you to maybe approach the microphone and talk about examples that you're familiar with, you practice as a teacher, as a principal, and now as a principal voice in this community for sanity in testing. Go.
Thanks, Adam. I was about to jump up here to respond to Rich's question, and I think one example could be the New York State Performance Standards Consortium schools. By no means perfect, but certainly moving in the direction that Dan has outlined up here in terms of doing things better. The system is based more on performance-based assessments in which students have to present work to a committee of teachers and community people, and they use rubrics to make a judgment. Of course, the same problem that Dan spoke to in terms of teaching to the rubric could be an issue, but I think the difference with consortium schools is that the aspect of evaluation or assessment becoming a learning experience as opposed to a game of what you get is a real shift in terms of a lens or a frame of reference for teaching. So that kids who are involved in presenting may not necessarily pass their exhibition, but they are getting feedback to go back and revise it and come back and present again. That's not necessarily what I would label as grade inflation, because I think it's more so an aspect of taking feedback and improving your product or whatever you're doing. So that's the best I can give right now.
Can I add a historical note to that? We've been immersed in high-stakes testing so long, most people don't realize that tests weren't actually designed to serve this function at all. We had a side conversation before that, the meeting about that, but standardized achievement testing really became common in the 1950s. And if you go back and read what the people who designed it wrote, they were really explicit, adamant, that they were not a substitute for the kind of teacher observation, teacher devised assessments that Dan is talking about. They were a supplement. Their argument was you use them to provide specialized information that teachers have difficulty seeing from within the context of their own school, not as a substitute for that. They actually called it specialized supplementary information. So it could give you, and so for example, if you look at the old ITBS, Irish Statistical Skills, it's not expected, there was no expectation that teachers would ever emulate that in their teaching. Quite the reverse. It has very small test items, and the reason was to break performance into pieces. So teachers, if they're looking at a complex performance like you're describing, where a student is struggling, can say, this suggests to me the problem is proportional reasoning, right? So we need to work on that. It was a diagnostic tool, and in fact, they urged people to administer it no later than October of the school year, because it wasn't supposed to summarize what kids did. It was supposed to give you hints about things you might want to do differently in your own work. So we developed this a political system where nobody uses these tests the way they were designed to be used. They're used to beat people up at the end of the school year.
Thank you. Final question or comment?
Oh, pressure. Thank you for sharing your expertise this evening. I attended a school back in the day where we had carpeting in our cafeteria. And it was great because it reduced the amount of noise in the cafeteria, but it absorbed a lot of stains, and it wasn't a great idea. And we didn't fault the person who put the carpet in. We faulted the next person who replaced the carpet with carpet. And one thing that I think has not been mentioned is Race to the Top funds, which were secured by New York State. I saw as NCLB, people were starting to admit, okay, this was a problem. And it was not realistic to expect 100% of students would be proficient. But then I thought New York State kind of sold its soul with Race to the Top acceptance when they started to tie the Regents' reform agenda into using assessments for monitoring teacher progress and those types of things. So I think the misuse of Race to the Top funds, I thought that was an opportunity that was, again, failed away because of money. The other thing, I'm sure there is test prep that happens, but as a former elementary school principal, I always remember that the state would change the scale score of what was considered proficient after the students had taken the assessment. So students would take the assessment in ELA or math, and the prior year the scale score was 632 was considered proficient, and then the next year it would be 648. And so if the scores didn't necessarily change because of test prep, or were not necessarily inflated because of test prep, but because the scaled score number changed arbitrarily, we think, because the state wanted to show a certain level of proficiency.
No, that's actually not what happens. What happens is that first of all, the tests are not exactly as difficult from year to year. There are two things going on. The number of items you need to get correct to reach a scale score will change basically because of mathematics. They don't exert control over that. Basically, there's a mathematical procedure that tries to estimate how much easier or harder the test has gotten.
Well, I was an elementary principal. I was not that smart. I wouldn't have known that. So, I'm just kidding.
The movement of the standards by a few points is mostly because the tests don't have enough questions to have score points in them. So they end up having to move it because there isn't a scale score of that at that value.
Yeah, we always consider it a moving target.
Yeah. Well,
and finally, I think one of the biggest concerns that I have is that too many politicians are involved in education. and they are making decisions about urban ed, or not even urban ed, but education in general. And I think my goal would not be to educate them, but to educate them out of being in education.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yes.
And is Margaret Sargent here? Margaret Sargent, Bill Gerber, these are people who work with the RTA to make these sessions possible. I want to thank all our partners in this. And I am encouraged by the fact that this will not be a one-shot deal. We're going to actually have this as a sustained conversation and a movement to offer better compelling alternatives to the mess that we're in right now with assessments. And I would like to invite you to join me in thanking Dr. Koretz for his wonderful speech. Dr. Koretz may be willing to stick around for some informal, brief conversations. Thank you very much for attending. Have a safe trip back home.